one is from Paul Baxa. And let me just say, I will admit, the word fascist got my name when I read this in the title. It got my attention immediately, because it's really a word that we hardly hear these days anymore. It's my only political statement for the day. Paul was part of our first symposium in 2015. He's been back several times. We're certainly happy to have him back in 2025. And I want you to listen carefully to see if there are any parallels between the post-war era of Grand Prix racing and the MAGA era that we're living in today. Oops, another political statement. Sorry about that. Anyway, we want to welcome Paul, our final speaker for the day. Stage is yours.
Thank you, Kip. Thank you. Before I begin, though, it's hard to believe that it was 10 years ago that we had the first symposium. And as was mentioned, I had the great privilege of being part of that. So I want to thank Don Capps and Pat Young, who's not here, and of course the late Michael Argetsinger. So it's amazing just how this has grown, and it's all credit to them for that. So thank you. Tragedy struck the second heat of the 1933 Monza Grand Prix. As Giuseppe Campari led into the banked Curva Sud on the first lap, he lost control of his Alfa Romeo. The car turned left sharply and flew over the banking. Behind him, the Maserati of Mario Baccon Borzacchini attempted to take evasive action. Borzacchini's car also flew over the banking, landing not far from Campari's overturned Alfa. Campari was killed instantly. Borzacchini died soon after in hospital. In one fell swoop, two of Italy's most prominent racers were killed in the same accident, possibly due to oil spilled during the previous heat. The race continued. Indeed, one more driver, the Polish racer Tchaikovsky, would be killed at the same spot later in the race. However, it was Campari and Borzacchini who garnered all the attention from the fascist press in the race's aftermath. Writing in the magazine Sport Fascista, Ruggero Zanetti depicted the two drivers as the fallen, using language that befitted the war dead. Most strikingly, the government film agency Luce displayed the word Presente superimposed over the wrecked cars. This is a still from that film. All right. This is the article I mentioned a minute ago. The use of words like the fallen and presente would not have surprised Italians in 1933. 11 years into the fascist dictatorship, it had become standard practice to treat fallen race drivers as martyrs, akin to those who died in the First World War and those who died in the cause of fascism after the war. This language of martyrdom and sacrifice found its way into the racing publications, like the official newsletter of the Scuderia Ferrari, which carried a front-page image of Borzacchini's funeral sculpture in his hometown of Terni. The accompanying article by Luigi Casini, borrowing from the mytho-poetic language of the poet Gabriele D'Annunzio, claimed Borzacchini and Campari had fallen for a high ideal, whose example and memory illuminates us, and their sacrifice inflames us. On that fatal day at Monza, their pure souls ascended to the spiritual world as an example of our increasing perfection. The language of sacrifice, redemption, and martyrdom found in Casini's eulogy of Borzacchini was one that Italians were accustomed to for centuries due to the country's strong Catholic culture. A paganized version of this sacralized imagery was promoted by D'Annunzio and could also be found in the language of the futurists. Both cultural tendencies, D'Annunzio's decadentism and the futurism of Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, fed into the imagery used by Benito Mussolini's fascist movement. It was through fascism that the idea of the race car driver as martyr became a standard narrative whenever an Italian driver was killed on the racetrack. Unfortunately, this happened often in the 1920s and 30s, so that by 1933, with the tragedies at Monza, it was almost second nature to turn to a sacrificial narrative. In this presentation, I will discuss how the narrative of sacrifice and martyrdom was used by the fascist press and how this became a means of incorporating motorsport into the fascist cultural project of creating the so-called fascist new man. I will begin by analyzing how the concept of martyrdom applied to motorsport and how Mussolini's fascist regime, borrowing again from D'Annunzio and the Futurists, insisted on depicting dead racers as heroes and martyrs to a cause. An important aspect of this includes not only how the fascist regime benefited from this narrative, but also how the prestige of Grand Prix racing in the 1920s and 30s gained from the use of such language. The final part of the paper will then examine this dynamic through 3 case studies. They are the deaths of Antonio Ascari, Giulio Mazzetti, and Emilio Materassi. The latter's death included those of spectators, who also were depicted as martyrs. These deaths, which occurred between 1925 and 1928, were foundational in the fascist narrative of martyrdom at the wheel of a racing car. And they served to exalt not only the drivers, but the sport of Grand Prix racing and the rise of the fascist dictatorship, which was crucially developing in this period. Before we study these 3 cases, we need to understand the roots of the sacrificial discourse around motorsport. On the shores of Lake Garda, northern Italy, Gabriele D'Annunzio, the so-called godfather of fascism, owned a sprawling villa which now serves as a museum. One of the rooms in the villa, the relics room, displays numerous sacred objects that D'Annunzio collected during his life. On one side of the room, there is an altar from a Catholic church, and on that altar, a broken and twisted steering wheel. The steering wheel belonged to the race car driver Henry Seagrave, and it had come from the power boat that he was racing in when he was killed in 1930. Seagrave was one of the most famous racers in the world. He had won the French Grand Prix in 1923 and held several land speed and water speed records before his death on Lake Windermere. Seagrave also contributed to the cult of speed with his book, The Lure of Speed, which attempted to explain his fascination with speed and its general cultural importance. The steering wheel was gifted to D'Annunzio from Seagrave's widow in honor of the close friendship between the 2 men. It is clear from the prominent position of the altar in the room and the room's name that D'Annunzio saw the wheel as a sacred relic. Seagrave's celebration of speed found a kindred spirit in D'Annunzio. A leading figure in Italian literature, D'Annunzio's writings exalted a mythical view of Italy, looking back to the great eras of Italian history, while denouncing the decadent state of contemporary Italy. During the First World War, despite being of advanced age, D'Annunzio volunteered for military service and became famous for his audacious exploits, such as taking on the Austrian Navy with his anti-submergible motorboat and dropping leaflets over Vienna demanding the Austrians surrender. Influenced by the German philosopher Nietzsche, D'Annunzio called for the formation of a new aristocracy of heroic warriors and artists to renew a dying mass culture. Using his time as an aviator as inspiration, he celebrated technology and speed as the means for renewing Italian culture. Although he never became a card-carrying fascist, D'Annunzio is considered its godfather, creating the so-called fascist style when he led a group of Italian war veterans to take over the city of Fiume in 1919, where he installed himself as dictator. This ill-fated venture ended in complete failure, but not before D'Annunzio inspired a new generation of political activists looking to overthrow Italian democracy in favor of an authoritarian, militaristic, and nationalistic state. At the center of D'Annunzio's universe was not only the airplane, but also the automobile, which he often described in religious terms. He would declare the airplane crash he suffered during the war, which left him temporarily blind, as a kind of spiritual awakening in his classic memoir, notturno. His villa on the shores of Lake Garda not only included his airplane, but also part of a warship, motorboats, a racing boat, and a garage of automobiles, one of which was gifted to him by Tazio Nuvolari. Another influence on the fascist narrative of martyrdom came from Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, a poet who founded the Futurist movement in 1909. The movement's manifesto exalted speed and industry as the harbingers of a new civilization, destined to leave the past-obsessed culture of Italy in the dust. In the manifesto, Marinetti describes an epiphany he experienced when he crashed the car into a ditch while trying to avoid a cyclist. And this really happened, and there's a picture of it. Before the accident, he exalted the aesthetics of his car, a Fiat, exclaiming that it was more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace, a classical statue. Rather than being chastened by the accident, Marinetti celebrated it as a rebirth, comparing the industrial sludge in the ditch to the milk from the breasts of his wet nurse. Marinetti and his followers, called Futurists, would go on to call for a new civilization based on the so-called religion morality of speed. Marinetti and D'Annunzio presented two contrasting visions of the past, with one wanting to destroy it, while the other hoping to revive a mythical past. However, they had in common a celebration of technology and the desire to create a new civilization. Both would feed into fascism's construction of a secular political religion that borrowed from the Catholic tradition, but also from the Risorgimentale tradition of Giuseppe Mazzini and Giuseppe Garibaldi. That one's for you, Duke. This new Italian would be, according to one historian, a virile, dynamic, and bellicose man, but at the same time, one who was a creative genius, who demonstrated strength, ability, and physical resistance, violence and fury in fight. This Italian was one forged in the trenches of the First World War, in which D'Annunzio and Marinetti participated, and subsequently enshrined in the values of Italian fascism with its celebration of violence and militarism. The race car driver, like the aviator, was the avatar of a new humanity of the machine age, through his possession of an artistic sensibility, who, in the words of Gunther Berghaus, created new laws of aesthetic creativity. This artist-creator would be the foundation of a new morality through a Nietzschean reevaluation of values, a fusion of art and speed intended to build a new society, according to Roger Griffin. In his analysis of futurism and speed, Jeffrey Schnapp has argued that the race car driver has developed a unique form of intelligence in an activity that is inherently excessive, extreme, and destructive, based on fantasy, frenzy, and unhinged ambition. The racetrack, argues Schnapp, channeling Marinetti, is a place for the anticipatory truths that will later bear fruits in the everyday life world. Both Marinetti and D'Annunzio, in their own way, provided the language used by Mussolini's fascism in exalting martyrdom, both on the battlefield and in the streets of Italy, during the clashes between fascists and their political opponents in the years following the First World War. Once fascism came into power in 1922, it transferred this language of martyrdom onto sports heroes, such as race car drivers. And there was no shortage of opportunities to do so. Some historians have argued that Italian fascism sacralized politics, raising its ideology to a political religion. In this religion, race car drivers were often seen as divinized beings, and autodromes like Monza depicted as temples of speed. To elevate dead racers as martyrs, they needed to die for a cause. What was this cause? Being one of the few sporting activities where its protagonists could be killed at any given moment, motorsport offered at least 3 causes for which one could give up their lives. These were national sporting pride, national industrial power, and the fascist anthropological aim of creating a new man. After the First World War, Grand Prix racing, like most other cultural and political activities, took a nationalist turn. Inspired by the epic 1914 Grand Prix of France, which became a contest between German and French makes on the eve of the Great War, Grand Prix racing became a theater for nationalism. New Grand Prix races dedicated to nations began with the Italian Grand Prix in 1921. The French Grand Prix obviously was the first one in 1906. Followed soon by the Spanish, German, Belgian, and British Grand Prix races. Moreover, the AIACR, which is the forerunner of the FIA, decreed that cars had to be entered in national colors: blue for France, white for Germany, red for Italy, etc. To be sure, the injection of nationalism into motorsport had existed previously in competitions like the Gordon Bennett Trophy, but it became more pronounced after 1920 due to the legacy of the war, which made competition between nations on the racetrack a continuation of competition on the battlefield. Moreover, new political ideologies like fascism promoted a form of militaristic hypernationalism that viewed motor racing as war by other means. Dying on the racetrack thus became a peacetime version of dying on the battlefield while defending one's national colors. Another cause was the advance of national industry. This too was framed in nationalist terms in fascist Italy as Mussolini's regime aimed to make Italy an industrial and thus military power. The construction of the Monza Autodrome and its combination of road and oval configurations were presented as a laboratory for progress, where manufacturers could test their latest technology. Tragedies like the one at Monza in 1928, which saw the death of numerous spectators, and which I'll speak more about a bit later, were often presented as the price that needed to be paid for progress. The most important cause, however, was that of advancing fascist ideology. Of the three causes presented here, this was the one that the fascist regime embraced more than the others, although the others were included in this, as it demonstrated a deep identification between motorsport and fascism. This was especially true of Grand Prix racing, a form of motorsport that best fit the fascist ideal. Grand Prix racing thus became amenable to creating the new fascist man. After the riding mechanic was abolished in the early 1920s, the Grand Prix race was conducted by a single driver in a car that was increasingly becoming technically advanced thanks to innovations in aircraft during the war. It was in Grand Prix racing that the supercharger was first introduced in 1923 at the Italian Grand Prix, a mechanical device that boosted the power of an engine beyond the normal atmospheric pressure. This technology brought the sport closer to that of the World War I aviators, as it was in the aircraft of the war that the supercharger was first developed. The aerodynamic shape of the Grand Prix car also came to resemble advances made in aviation. The race driver came to wear the helmets and goggles of the aviator, thus completing the aesthetic association between driver and flyer. It helped, too, that several race car drivers were aviators and war heroes, like Georges Boileau in France and Eddie Rickenbacker in the United States. In Italy, the association between the two activities was exalted in the persons of Mussolini and other fascists like Italo Balbo, who were enthusiasts of both flying and racing. It seemed only natural when the family of World War I hero and aviator Francesco Baracca gave his prancing horse symbol to Enzo Ferrari in 1923. Like the air aces of the war, the Grand Prix driver was given the task of taming a highly advanced piece of technology at dangerous speeds, an example of the futurist machine cult, where the enemy to be conquered was not only your opponent, but also time and space. It is no surprise that fascist Italy embraced Grand Prix racing and even saved it when it appeared as if it was about to die due to the lack of interest from automobile manufacturers. In 1928, Italy ran the only Grand Prix after all the others had been canceled due to lack of entries. Moreover, it was Italian drivers who spearheaded the Scuderia movement, whereby drivers purchased Grand Prix cars from the factories and created their own teams, the most famous being the Scuderia Ferrari. Only in fascist Italy, it seemed, was the thoroughbred nature of the Grand Prix car fully appreciated. All this came at a time when Italian Grand Prix drivers were dying in great numbers. This is from the Corriere della Sera after the Bandini tragedy in 1967, showing a list of all the Italian drivers who had died in racing cars. When Campari and Borzacchini were killed in 1933, they became the 8th and 9th Italians to be killed in Grand Prix races since Mussolini's coming to power in 1922. The list of Italian dead was long and seemed to outnumber those from other countries. Furthermore, the dead represented some of the top racers of their day, like Antonio Ascari, Pietro Bordino, Luigi Arcangeli, and Gastone Brilli Peri. There were 3 deaths, though, in particular, that fed the fascist cult of dead racers. And these deaths came at a time when Mussolini was fascistizing sport and Grand Prix racing was entering into deep crisis. So the first one we'll look at is Antonio Ascari. Ascari was the first dead racer to be sacralized, and he was killed while leading the 1925 French Grand Prix in the unbeatable P2 Alfa Romeo. Ascari was Alfa's leading driver, having won the previous 2 Grand Prix in Italy and Belgium. Not only did he win races, but he was renowned for his aggressive driving that had, earlier in his career, led to numerous accidents. Now, he was an integral part of an already legendary racing team that put Italy at the top of the sport. The fascist regime wasted no time in exalting the success of the Alfas during a period when Mussolini's government was on the brink of collapsing in the aftermath of the Matteotti crisis. In 1925, while Mussolini was putting into place the one-party dictatorship, the Alfas were dominating the Grand Prix circuits with Ascari leading the way. His 10/10 style, often called Garibaldino, after the national hero of Italian unification, exemplified the audacious new man aesthetic that the regime was promoting. Ascari's death, while leading the French Grand Prix, was immediately mythologized. He was racing on foreign soil, and he was beating his opponents. The only battle was against time, as he continued to stretch his lead, all the while taking great risks. Ascari was known for hugging the apex of corners, often risking hitting the barriers or whatever else was on the edge of the track. At Montlery, the site of the French Grand Prix that year, a picket fence lined some of those corners. And it was against this, at a fast left-hander, that Ascari's car came to grief when his car snagged one of the posts. Eyewitnesses said that Ascari kept getting closer to that fence on each lap, despite his significant lead. He lost control, the car flipped over, and he was thrown out, with the car landing on top of him. He died soon after of his injuries. As a mark of respect, the Alfa Romeo team was withdrawn from the race, an episode recalled in John Frankenheimer's Grand Prix, if you remember that film, if anyone's ever seen it. The next day, Ascari's body was put on a train in Paris and sent back to Italy. And this was the scene at the Paris train station. Here, the myth of the dead hero was played up to the max. An ornate catafalque was placed at the Paris train station. When the train crossed the Italian frontier, 2 wreaths were put on the casket. One came from Gabriele D'Annunzio, and the other from Benito Mussolini. The wreath for Mussolini read, "To the intrepid one." All along the route, Ascari's train was greeted by mourners, and at the various train stations, flowers were placed on the casket. When the train arrived at Milan's central station, it was met by thousands of people. Astute observers noted how this extraordinary procession of the train echoed a similar event 4 years previously when Italy's unknown soldier was transported from the World War I battlefields to Rome. The comparison of Ascari's death to the dead of the First World War became a leitmotif in the days following the accident. In the pages of the Royal Automobile Club of Italy's magazine, Ascati's death was called a renewal of the martyrdom and miracles that had bloodied the tormented fields of the Carso and the Piave. Those are two important fronts in the First World War. The fallen of today are worthy of those from the past in honor of the same ardent spirit and pursuit of the same ideals. The obituary went on to say that Ascati represented Italy, who gave his life so that Italy could once again become the strongest and most audacious nation on earth. During the funeral, a group of airplanes flew low and dropped wreaths, strengthening the connection between Ascati and the aviators of the First World War. Such sentiments expressed by the Automobile Club characterized Ascati's imposing public funeral in Milan. His body was carried in procession through the city, starting from the Alfa Romeo factory, where his body lay in state and where some 2,000 mourners had come to pay their respects. And you see that on the left. In their reporting of the funeral, the fascist newspapers noted Ascati's adherence to the local fascist organization and that the procession deliberately passed through neighborhoods where fascist martyrs had been killed during the so-called years of struggle after World War I. When his body reached the Cimitero Monumentale, where Milan's most notable citizens were interred, a series of eulogies were given declaring Ascati a martyr who had immolated himself for the fatherland. Ascati's boss, Nicola Romeo, addressed the huge crowd, comparing Ascati's death akin to dying on the battlefield. Like a soldier who dies gripping his gun, so too did Ascati, who never let go of the steering wheel, which was not actually true because he was thrown out. The most significant eulogy, however, came from Lando Ferretti. A Tuscan fascist of the first hour, Ferretti was a member of the Italian parliament, a journalist, and the new president of the Italian Olympic Committee, which is called CONI. In his time as president of CONI, Ferretti would help craft the fascist regime's sporting policies, as expressed in the Charter of Sport, which effectively fascistized all levels of sport, both professional and amateur. As a writer, Ferretti devoted his time to mythologizing Italy's sporting achievements, raising their protagonists to the level of national heroes and sometimes martyrs. In his eulogy, which you see him giving here, Ferretti exhorted all present to bow down before Ascati, declaring his death a loss not just for Italy, but for all the world. Ferretti also led the crowd through the so-called fascist rite of martyrs, which involved having them kneel and giving the Presente exhortation with arms outstretched in the fascist salute. Shortly after, and this is the tomb of Antonio and Alberto Ascari, Antonio's son Alberto, who died 30 years later. And this is the tomb with the two sculptures of father and son. Shortly after this, the French even erected a monument to Ascati near the site where he died. And this was a picture taken at the time. I don't know if that is still there in France. Ferretti's words at the cemetery foreshadowed his theories on sporting heroes as builders of fascist culture. In an essay called Culture and Sport, Ferretti claimed that culture needs the virility and athleticism of sport to prevent it from becoming too erudite or intellectual. It's no longer enough to die as a soldier on the Carso, wrote Ferretti. Now we must win, advance, and trounce our opponents in sport. In Mussolini's Italy, culture and sport are not opposed, claimed Ferretti. Rather, they are two pages of the same book. The book is the gospel of the power and glory of Italy. Ferretti attempted to prove this a year later when Giulio Mazzetti, our second example, was killed at the Targa Florio. and that's Ferretti on the left. In the same book that Culture and Sport appeared, Ferretti included a chapter on Giulio Mazzetti, a Tuscan nobleman and two-time winner of the Targa Florio. And I have the cover of the book and the table of contents next to it. Ferretti's book consisted of a series of essays on prominent Italians whose lives were served as an example of the new fascist era. And this is the astonishing part. The book included cultural figures like Dante Alighieri and Ludovico Ariosto. Among them was Mazzetti, the only sportsman to appear in the book. When Mazzetti died in 1926, Ferretti penned a series of articles on his achievements on the racetrack, but also on his status as hero and martyr. In his tribute to Mazzetti, Ferretti called him a martyr to sporting passion, next to the purest heroes of the fatherland. Ferretti argued that Mazzetti's blood was not spilled in vain. Rather, his spirit is now beyond the infinite, where reside the purest heroes of the fatherland and of humanity. Ferretti goes on to acknowledge a pantheon of fallen race drivers, including Biagio Nazzaro and Antonio Ascari, whose ultimate sacrifices provided a sharp rebuke to the so-called sedentary morality of pacifists who do not know bravery. Ferretti's challenge to those critics who claim that racers died for nothing echoed fascist and denuncian rhetoric regarding men of action who, in their struggle against time and space, the natural enemies of man, sacrificed themselves for Promethean fire in the struggle against mediocrity. Ferretti also took the opportunity to affirm Mazzetti's fascist credentials. Florentine fascism exalts Mazzetti as a militant of the first hour. He was also someone who recognized the importance of sport and of machines in building Italian glory. Giulio Mazzetti, wrote Ferretti, along with the fallen of the trenches and the fascist fallen of the piazzas, is a symbol of the power of the Italian people. Channeling futurist language, Ferretti noted that despite coming from a city filled with museums, like Florence, Mazzetti had inspired a movement of sporting youth whose example was needed to teach the children of Florence that he too was young once, like them, and did not content himself with bourgeois mediocrity. Furthermore, his ability to control the powerful machinery of a racing car will help Italy prepare for a future war, where Italians will use machinery to crush their opponents. Well, that was his hope anyway. Lest we view Lando Ferretti as an isolated case of someone who used overheated denuncian and futurist rhetoric, he was not alone in sacralizing the Tuscan aristocrat, whose image was used to promote a fascist aristocracy of warriors. Mazzetti's achievements were glorified in several monuments and plaques. Today, there is a marker on the site of the accident, and there's another plaque found in the town of Termini Imerese, which was the headquarters of the old Targa Florio. Sorry, that's this one. Yet another, using clear fascist language, is found at the Passo della Futa in Tuscany, through which the old Mugello racetrack and the Mille Miglia eventually passed. And that's this one. This plaque, made by the noted sculptor Amerigo Passani, was put up by the local fascists, celebrating Mazzetti's triumphs on the Mugello, while also noting his death in Sicily. According to the inscription, he was an example of how one can always strive for Italy and die in pursuit of new glories. To affirm Mazzetti's place in the pantheon of Italian heroes, which Ferretti compared to the classical heroes of antiquity, which you can also note in the plaques. A note was written for him by Delfino Cinelli, which appeared in the pages of the Automobile Club's journal. In the poem, Cinelli compares Mazzetti to the mythological figure of Icarus, who was brought down in his heroic attempt to defeat nature. Like Icarus, Mazzetti's challenge to nature also failed, but he died with a smile on his face for having tried. This language, a cross between the classical ode, denuncian, decadentism, and futurism, would again be harnessed in 1928 with the death of Emilio Materassi. Only this time, it would include the death of spectators. So this brings us to our third example. In 1928, Lando Ferretti was no longer the president of Italy's Olympic Committee. His writings, however, had laid down a template for how to exalt dead race car drivers under the fascist regime. That year, the so-called fascist revolution was nearly complete. Liberal democracy was dead, and Italy was now under the authoritarianism of a one-party state, ruled by a man who viewed sport as one of the most important activities of the new Italian. Motor racing was one of the most important elements of this new culture of sport. However, as I mentioned earlier, Grand Prix racing was in crisis, and the Italian Grand Prix was the only such race on the racing calendar that year, a fact that was emphasized by the fascist press in the days leading up to the race. Due to its being the only Grand Prix of the season, the Italian press hyped up the event as a battle of giants, to be contested in front of a crowd with a feverish need for speed. The setting of Monza was exalted as the site of a titanic contest that will leave a profound mark in the history of Grand Prix racing. Little did they know that this would prove correct, although not in the way they intended. Notably, the fascist newspaper Popolo d'Italia seemed to foreshadow the coming tragedy when it claimed that Monza had asked for sacrifices in the past. The sacrifices that Monza required in 1928 proved considerable. On lap 17 of that race, the red Talbot, driven by Materassi, appeared to make contact with another car on the front straight, the Rettifiglio. The car veered left and plunged into a thick row of spectators at high speed. Materassi was killed instantly, along with 20 spectators, injuring scores of others, some of whom died later. It was the worst racing accident to date, exceeding the infamous Paris-Madrid of 1903, and only surpassed in 1955 with the Le Mans tragedy. The race continued and was won by Louis Chiron in a Bugatti. The site of the accident resembled a war zone. One newspaper noted that the site was cleared by fascist black shirts and that the dead and wounded were greeted by fascist salutes as they were stretchered off. The war imagery proved apt as the car actually came to rest in a trench that separated the track from the spectators. Echoes of war and the language of sacrifice and martyrdom followed quickly, with the spectators also considered martyrs. The day after the accident, the victims were carried in procession through the town of Monza to the railway station. Materassi's body followed at the end in the parade of corpses. Described as the fallen, the death of spectators was attributed to fate and to the dangers and risks that daily life presented to everyone. The crowds came out for the funerals of Materassi and for the victims. One of the funerals in the northern city of Bergamo allegedly brought out 25,000 people to witness the procession. Materassi's funeral in his hometown of San Pietro a Sieve near Florence also brought out the crowds. The town commemorated him with a prominent statue that still stands in a public park. His graveside plaque, meanwhile, on the left, noted that he was a martyr and hero who brought glory to Italian sport. Not everyone bought into the language of martyrdom and sacrifice. The Vatican, for example, made it clear that it did not appreciate dead race car drivers being celebrated as martyred saints. The Vatican's official newspaper, the Osservatore Romano, which did not normally report on sporting events, condemned the tragedy as a massacre and a crime, and laid it at the feet of those who promoted pagan blood sports like racing and boxing. For the Catholic newspaper, Monza was a new pagan amphitheater, akin to the Colosseum, and blood sport had become a new religion that appealed to the young men who risked their lives for nothing but speed. The Vatican condemned the public spectacle of the funerals as if the spectators had died for a noble cause. The Jesuit journal, Civiltà Cattolica, called the tragedy and the subsequent spectacle an insult to humanity. The Vatican's strong attacks on the event and the way it was depicted as a sacrifice required a response, and it came from the race director of the Grand Prix, Renzo Castagneto, in the journal Sport Fascista. Apart from his role as race director, Castagneto was also one of the founders of the Mille Miglia, and thus one of the most important figures in Italian motorsport. While not naming the Vatican's newspaper directly, he took exception to the comparison to boxing. Castagneto went on to respond to specific criticisms of the circuit and its safety measures, arguing that Materassi's accident was an outlier since it occurred on a straightaway. The most telling part of the defense came with Castagneto's placing of the tragedy in a fascist frame. There is a gap, wrote Castagneto, between the fascist mentality of today and the old mentality of yesterday. Racing needs to continue at the Monza Autodrome, argued Castagneto, because man needs the automobile to reach supreme goals. He was confident that the crowds will return to Monza because of its inherent fascination and the contribution to the Italian automotive industry. Most importantly, noted Castagneto, quoting the secretary of the Fascist Party, Augusto Turati, Italians need to live dangerously, and the battle between nations needs to continue. Castagneto seemed to have won that debate. Remarkably, 1 month after the tragedy, before the motorcycle Grand Prix of Nations was held at Monza, a Catholic Requiem Mass was celebrated on the site of the accident. The chief presider was Don Riccardo Jolli, the chaplain of Milan's fascist party. Ignoring the condemnation of the Vatican of the tragedy, Jolli claimed in his homily, that's the sermon that the priest gives, that the victims were sacrificed for a higher cause, that of human progress. Reading from the parable of the mustard seed, Jolli told his audience that for anything to grow, a seed had to be destroyed, and that this seed was like the sacrifice made on the battlefield. The fallen of any human activity, Jolli said, should serve to inspire new works and new conquests. Assisting at the Mass were high fascist officials like Turati, the secretary, and the aviator and World War I ace, Mario de Bernardi. That's those three figures in the middle. So to conclude, by the time Campari and Borzacchini died at Monza in 1933, the martyr hero discourse used in fascist Italy was well rehearsed. Fortunately, it did not have to be used for Italy's two most famous racers in the 1930s, Nuvolari and Achille Varzi. No doubt, both would have received similar honors had they been killed, especially Nuvolari. Nonetheless, the fascist regime set a precedent that would be used by other authoritarian states. For example, the death of Bernd Rosemeyer in 1938, who became a martyr hero for Nazi Germany, even more so as he died trying to break a speed record on Hitler's new Autobahn system. The fascist regime ended with the Second World War, but the plaques and the statues to the dead racers remain, with the fascist language intact. The sporting heroes exalted by Mussolini's regime outlived the dictatorship with their legends unsullied, ignoring the role played by Lando Ferretti and others to paint them as exemplars of the new fascist man. Indeed, Ferretti would go on to lead Italy's successful 1960 Olympic bid. While the regime met its demise, the promotion that it gave Grand Prix racing through its apotheosis of dead racers arguably went a long way to saving the sport. The deaths of spectators of Monza in '28 could have killed the sport. Instead, it presented an opportunity to present the massacre as worthwhile and serving a higher cause. Monza, which would take more lives in subsequent years, is now known as the Temple of Speed, a name that's used today. In fact, I was watching I think it was the Formula Regional race from Monza a couple of weeks ago on YouTube, and under one of the signs, it said Temple of Speed. Today, we no longer use the language of martyrdom to describe dead racers. The notion of racers as national heroes has come down to us, though. An aura seems to surround those drivers who have been killed on the racetrack. The discourse around legendary drivers like Jim Clark, Gilles Villeneuve, and Ayrton Senna often verge towards idolatry. For example, the discourse around Clark is that he was somehow viewed as immune from death. If he could die in a race car, then none of us are safe, was a common reaction to his death in 1968. When Gilles Villeneuve died at Zolder in 1982, his funeral was attended by the Canadian Prime Minister, and his death became an occasion of national mourning, especially in his native Quebec. As for Senna, a massive public funeral in Sao Paulo was watched by hundreds of thousands and attended by politicians, celebrities, and racing legends. And I think there was a period of national mourning as well. To be sure, none of this is fascist, but I would argue that the kind of celebration of dead racers fostered by Mussolini's regime in the 20s and 30s laid the groundwork for these rites that often surround dead Grand Prix drivers, and that this aura around them, like it or not, has been central in the mythos that surrounds Grand Prix racing to this day. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That was fascinating.
Thank you.
Questions, comments? Anyone? Lana?
I'm curious, in your research, have you come upon any writings from the drivers themselves or their families, specifically I think of the wives, discussing this concept, and maybe speaking out against it or in favor of it?
No. In fascist Italy, only the official press was allowed to speak. I know that Tazio Nuvolati wrote some articles for some of the journals at the time. And surprisingly, if you know about Nuvolati and kind of the aura that surrounds him, he actually went to great lengths to say, there's nothing mystical or spiritual about what I do. In fact, it's very technical and scientific. And he tried to describe how he turned cars into corners. And so if anything, that might be a little bit of a contradiction to the kind of hyper aesthetic language that was used. Yeah. But in terms of families, no. I didn't come across anything. So, yeah, but thank you for that.
So something you can add to your Gilles Villeneuve reference. The circuit in Montreal is now called Le Circuit Gilles Villeneuve.
That's
and
right.
I think that goes along with your comments.
That's right. And I think Salut Gilles is still written on the start-finish line, right?
I assume so.
Yeah, and I know that at Imola for many years, where he started his last race, the Canadian flag was on the third spot on the grid, but I don't think it's there anymore. Yes, and there is a Ferrari a Villeneuve museum.
Yeah,
too.
I was just going to say it's between Three Rivers and Montreal,
that's
halfway.
right.
There's a museum
Yep.
totally dedicated to him.
Yep.
It's amazing.
That's right,
Yeah,
yeah.
It's like a shrine.
Yeah.
That's a very regional thing.
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. By the way, on that topic, I think the statue to Villeneuve was recently stolen, I believe, or vandalized or something. This happened. Yes. No, I think it was in Quebec. I think it was, but if you could look that up. Yeah.
It seems back in those days there was a complete disregard for driver and public safety. When did things like roll bars, seat belts, and restraints start to come about?
Oh, late 60s for the roll bar? Oh, because of the... Yeah, that's right. Yeah. 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 But in terms of roll bars and harnesses, that comes much later, right? Like 70s. Yeah. Yeah.
So nationalism is arguably the big tent under which this particular case resides.
Yes.
Testing?
Yeah. Yeah, it's fine. It's fine.
We think of the World Cup and the Olympics as the supreme
Yes.
examples today.
Yeah.
But nationalism and politics and commercialism all intertwine pretty neatly.
Yeah.
So I guess my rather inarticulate question is, can you have this high level of sporting activity without what we'll call nationalism?
That's a good question. I don't know if you can. Yeah, I think it's unavoidable. And the aura, or the way the apotheosis is kind of an old-fashioned word that's used, I think can't be avoided because of the type of media, celebrity attention that's given to them. And as you say, the marketing as well. I don't think I mean, the Olympics, it's in the 1920s especially that the Olympics start to develop all this kind of nationalistic, ceremonial stuff that it has today. And so, yeah, it's after World War I that I think a lot of this starts to seep into sport. First World Cup is in 1930, I think, Uruguay. It wasn't really a big deal. The first real important World Cup, famous one, was 34 in fascist Italy. And so I think after World War I with this hyper-nationalism, it starts to grip onto sport. And I think it's remained to this day. So.
When Dale Earnhardt died, there was great mourning in the NASCAR nation to the point where the executives at NBC and the mainstream media said, who is this guy? How did we miss this story? Because part of the nation was in mourning and the New York City people weren't even aware of it and were trying to find out why is there this mourning. And also, I remember when Nuvolari died, was it 49 or 50?
53.
I hate to say I'm that old, but there was great mourning at that time.
Yes.
And I remember pictures of him laid out on his bed.
Yes, the
at
center
home.
has them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, center has a couple of pictures of him laid down on his bed in his racing suit with trophies next to him. So.
All right, Paul, I've got one from the internet. Mario Teche writes from Napoli. He says, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. You clearly showed how fascist ideology affected both Italian car racing and its narration through the press and official Cine Giornali, the newsreels. And his question is, do you think that any of these ideas are still present today in Italian and international motor racing and all media communicating these activities? Moreover, can we see car racing as positive competition rather than a war fight?
Positive? Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm a big racing fan, so it pains me to talk about the association with authoritarianism and fascism. But no, it is definitely positive. Nationalism, I still think, yes, you can still see that with certain drivers. I'm thinking of when a driver like Colapinto and the kind of passion that's aroused in Argentina. And there's probably a few more recent examples as well. Think of, I mean, sorry? Oh, that's right, yeah. And, yeah, of course. No, but Michael Schumacher, before Schumacher, Formula One was not that big in Germany. I mean, they had the German Grand Prix, but it wasn't really a huge deal in Germany compared to other countries. But when Schumacher started to win, it just became massively popular, and you got these fans, a bit like the Orange Army now, which had a certain kind of strong nationalistic thing about them. To the point that it's kind of strange, because after Schumacher leaves, Vettel and others never got the same type of passion. So I don't know, that's maybe a paper for another day. But yes, I think the nationalism is still there, absolutely.
So I was just wondering if any of the drivers that you found were like publicly expressive in support of fascism, or do you know if they would be less than pleased that their memory was being used to support the ideology?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. It is interesting that they all, of course, supported it, but it's hard to say if any of them were dyed-in-the-wool fascists. Antonio Ascati, for example, did belong to the local fascist organization in Milan. But again, you know, what that means in a dictatorship, right? A lot of people join things for opportunism. There was one guy I mentioned, Gastone Brilli Peri, who was probably the most fascist. And he may have actually participated in fascist violence after the war. But in terms of the others, it's all very vague. Yeah, it's never clear, and it's research I'd like to do, actually, to find out, you know, if these guys were ever real kind of enthusiastic fascists. Enzo Ferrari, I showed you that Scuderia Ferrari magazine. He wrote a column for that magazine, and he did use fascist language. But you know, after the war, it was often said about him that he was never a fascist, that he only supported it just out of opportunism. But he did use it, and he was close friends with a couple of important and prominent fascists at the time. So that's a great question, and I've always been frustrated by never finding clear answers on that. It's all very fuzzy and vague. But if you listen to their public pronouncements, which weren't that many, by the way, they didn't really talk to drivers in the same way they do now. You don't get these lengthy interviews. Sometimes you do, but it's not as often as it is today. I think occasionally they'll use the language, but it's hard to say if that really makes them fascists. So, but that's a great question. And Nuvolati's always been a mystery to me on that, because I don't think he ever did or said anything that was blatantly fascist. But he's always been a bit of a mystery. So yeah, thank you for that. That's a great question.
Paul, to follow up on Jim's question earlier, as somebody who follows World Cup, and it's coming to the United States next year.
And Canada and Mexico, too.
That's a national-based team, so that kind of lends itself to nationalism. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, do you think it's fair to say that today you can't have the same kind of nationalistic pride or competition in Formula One, given the international components? I mean, drivers are racing for different teams. They're not racing for a certain country or even a make. They're driving all kinds of cars.
Yes, that's a good comment, but I'm going to disagree a little bit on that, because you have the national anthems, of course. Drivers, again, I mentioned Schumacher, Colapinto. I would say Fernando Alonso, too. I mean, Spaniards didn't really care about Formula One until he came around. Verstappen's another one, absolutely. And also, there is a national team in Formula One. It's called Ferrari. So that's the only country where the team is more important than the drivers. And I remember the sad story of Riccardo Patrese, who was leading the 1983 San Marino Grand Prix. And he crashed like a few laps from the end, and the crowd cheered because that meant the Ferrari was going to win. Ferrari was driven by Frenchmen. Patrese was an Italian. But they cheered, you know, because the car was more important, even though it was driven by a Frenchman. So I would slightly disagree.
I don't know, Paul. Paul, hey.
Oh, hey.
I don't know, Paul. I remember when Ricciardo won Monza, the Italians were like, close enough. Ricciardo, that's close enough for us.
Yeah,
all
sure.
right.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, well, the Monza crowds are always passionate.
Yes, they are. I will say in passing, one of a previous comment, there are NASCAR fans in New York City. So let's just say that for them. I want to stand up for them and say some people in the South could give a shit about NASCAR. I want to make that distinction too. So I'm kind of curious about, you know, nationalism. Let me put it this way. Let's just treat motorsport as neutral. It could be used for good or used for bad, right? Like a museum, for example. Yeah. So in nationalism, too, I think there are good forms of national pride, because otherwise, I wonder if it actually diverts some of these, I don't know what you call them, I guess animal instincts toward violence, maybe channels them into something like sport, which can be productive, versus something like war, which isn't productive. That sometimes, especially for people like I think one of the reasons Verstappen's so popular, I have a friend who's half Dutch, is because they're like, we didn't have anything to be proud about for so long. And we got occupied so often by other countries. So to have somebody who speaks Dutch, who is really, really Dutch, it makes us so proud that we can have that. Not in a way of like, we hate other countries, but just, hey, this is the local kid, and we can be proud of him. So it can be a bit positive that way.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, I'm a Ferrari fan, so I've got no problem waving the Ferrari flag and the Italian flag. And
But I'm also
so,
wondering
yeah.
if how much that being able to use motorsport for fascism is you have to have an economic precondition of a lot of disaffected young men with nothing better
Yes.
to do.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, and of course, you think of Fangio, Juan Manuel Fangio, great national Argentinian hero, but his career was helped by the dictator, Perón. And that was another developing country that needed to get people doing positive things, but it was a dictatorship. Yeah, so. That's it.
Thanks, Paul. That was really terrific.
Thank
I think
you.
Margaret has a couple closing
Yep.
words for us.
Thank you.